Hello, this is Miss Lewis. Welcome to World Book Day. I'm going to read you a chapter from one of my favourite books, the BFG, written by Roald Dahl. The reason why I love this book so much is because I basically read it from cover to cover over and over again throughout my childhood, and it's still a favourite to read to my son now. Let me tell you a little bit about the author Roald Dahl. He was a spy, an ace fighter pilot, a chocolate historian and a medical inventor. He was also the author of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Matilda, the BFG and many more brilliant stories. I'm sure you've heard of him before and can name lots of books that you've read by him. He remains the world's #1 storyteller. The reason why I love the BFG so much is because it's full of made-up words that the author decided to include. This is chapter 5, the BFG. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. Now he really is going to eat me, Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from his head as he wished. "I's hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned, showing massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. "Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. "Just because I is a giant, you think I is a man-goblin cannibal?" he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all cannibally and murderful, and they does gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere round. Out there, us has the famous bone-crunching giant. Bone-crunching giant crunches up 2 whoopsie-whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-bursting. Noise of crunchy bones go crackety-crack for miles around." "Ouch," Sophie said. "Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings from Turkey," the giant said. "Every night Bone Cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble Turks." Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark that she became quite angry. "Why Turks?" she blurted out. "What's wrong with the English?" "Bone-crunching giant says Turks is tasting ever so much juicier and more scrumdiddly-umptious. Bone Cruncher says Turkish human beings has a glamoury flavour. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of turkey." "I suppose they would," Sophie said. "Of course they would," the giant shouted. "Every human being is diddly and different. Some is scrumdiddly-umptious and some is uckly-shush. Greeks is all full of uckly-shush. No giant is eating Greeks, ever." "Why not?" Sophie asked. "Greeks from Greece is all tasting greasy," the giant said. "I imagine that's possible too," Sophie said. She was wondering with a bit of a tremble what all this talking about eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with this peculiar giant and smile at his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite by talking about food. "As I am saying," the giant went on, "all human beings is having different flavours. Human beings from Panama is tasting very strong of hats." Why hats? Sophie said. You is not very clever, the giant said, moving his great ears in and out. I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bung-dongle. Do you like vegetables? Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation towards a slightly less dangerous kind of food. You is trying to change the subject, the giant said sternly. We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of the human bean. The human bean is not a vegetable. Oh, but the bean is a vegetable, Sophie said. Not the human bean, the giant said. The human bean has 2 legs and a vegetable has no legs at all. Sophie didn't argue any more. The last thing she wanted to do was to make the giant cross. The human bean, the giant went on, is coming in dillions of different flavours. For instance, human beans from Wales is tasting very whooshy of fish. There is something very fishy about Wales. You mean Wales, Sophie said. Wales is something quite different. Wales is Wales, the giant said. Don't gobble funk around with words. I will now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey has a most disgustable woolly tickle on the tongue, the giant said. Human beings from Jersey is tasting of cardigans. You mean jerseys, Sophie said. You are once again gobble funking, the giant shouted. Don't do it. This is a serious and snitching subject. May I continue? Please do, Sophie said. Danes from Denmark is tasted ever so much of dogs, the giant went on. Of course, Sophie said. They taste of Great Danes. Wrong, cried the giant, slapping his thigh. Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they is tasting of Labradors. Then what do the people of Labrador taste of? Sophie asked. Danes! The giant cried triumphantly. Great Danes! Aren't you getting a bit mixed up? Sophie said. I is a very mixed up giant, the giant said. But I does do my best. And I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know one who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper. Wellington? Sophie said. Where is Wellington? Your head is full of squashed flies, the giant said. Wellington is in New Zealand. The human beings in Wellington has an especially scrumdiddlyumptious taste. So says the welly-eating giant. What do the people of Wellington taste of? Sophie asked. Boots, the giant said. Of course, Sophie said. I should have known. Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over and done with right away than being kept hanging around any more. What sort of human beings do you eat? She asked, trembling. Me? Shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars rattle on their shelves. Me? Gobbling up human beings? This I never. The others, yes. All the others is gobbling them up every night, but not me. I is a freaky giant. I is a nice and jumbly giant. I is the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. I is the big, friendly giant. I is the BFG. What is your name? My name's Sophie, Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news she had just heard. that's the end of that chapter, chapter 5. I hope you enjoyed the chapter. If you haven't read the BFG before, I think that will give you a little taste of what it's like. I can't help but put in those amazing words, the way that Roald Dahl made them up. And I'm sure when you're reading it, if you're reading it to yourself or you're reading it out loud, you may end up doing the same thing, creating that character voice. Enjoy the rest of World Book Day, and we'll see you soon.